I'd like to thank Esther and Joan for inviting me here today. And as they say, it was a trial by volcano, because I got to the Human Rights and Intellectual Disability Conference within an hour and 15 minutes of presenting my work there, having not slept for 36 hours, because the flights were very, very delayed, and it was looking that I wasn't likely to get here anyway. So I was obviously meant to be here, having come out on one of the first planes to get up there, although that could have been risky. We might have been the guinea pig, but we got here. No ash in the engine, fortunately. So I'm not quite sure how your format usually goes, so I'm going to be reading from my paper, going through a few slides, and introducing you a bit later on to some of just a tiny amount of vignettes from others, and also some of my autoethnographic vignettes as well. As Esther said, I'm a parent of a learning disabled daughter, as you say, someone with intellectual disabilities here. She's 23 years old, so I have that life experience already before me with regards to education, intimacy and such like. So we've been going through that process for some years now. I also worked within Learning Disability Services for a charitable housing association between doing my Masters and my PhD with adults with intellectual disabilities. So I have some experience of it. And as Esther and Joan point out, I also am able to kind of bring that sociological and theoretical nuance to my work with regards to trying to understand disability and disabled social world for all intents and purposes. But to kind of broaden it out a little bit more for you, as not everybody in the room is necessarily interested in disability research, I'm going to try and start by looking at reflexivity and feminist research in order to kind of understand how we might go about understanding that reflexive process of research, of qualitative research. So the paper generally is looking at that research reflexivity from the inside out, and what I mean by that is that many of us do begin our research process and journey from sometimes either being personally touched by a particular social phenomenon, working within a particular area, or having experienced it through family or our own personal experience. So I'm starting from that premise really in terms of thinking about being an insider researcher. So there's something we might already know about a particular social process. Then I'm also going to look at mothering a learning disabled child or adult. So that will come out in some of the research that I've done in the PhD that come out in the book. And then to finish off, looking at personal narrative in understanding social issues. So hopefully you'll see the sort of journey as we go through it, in the sense of my own journey, but not really a personal narrative to a certain extent going through it. So beginning to research reflexively, thinking about theory and method. As I say, I'm going to start by thinking about the insider. Doing research not as personal narrative, but simply as an insider, but also a researcher. So as I've already said, we're thinking about doing research where we have some personal connection, but we're not about to embark on autoethnography or autobiography. So I'm not about to start thinking or writing about my own story, but I'm actually thinking about how I'm going to do this social research, but I am actually an insider. So I wanted to start by a little vignette from my own research journal, post-interviews, and my interviews were qualitative, in-depth interviews with mothers who had children or young adults with intellectual disabilities. So this is what I wrote in my one of my journal entries. Post-interviews. I'm halfway through the fieldwork process and the phone rings. Hello, is Chrissy there, please? Speaking, I reply, not recognising the voice on the other end of the phone. It's Karen, pseudonym. You interviewed me last year. Oh, hi, I replied, embarrassed that I hadn't immediately remembered her. I was wondering if you'd like to meet for lunch, or catch up, she asked. Is everything okay? I said without really thinking. I thought perhaps she wanted to meet me as my researcher self. Maybe there was something I could do for her. Or maybe there was some more information about her son, who has Down syndrome, that would be useful for the research. I was only half right. She did want to talk about her son, but she also wanted to catch up as if we were old friends. We made an arrangement to meet at a local pub at a time that suited my already busy schedule. She wanted to know how my love life was, and what was going on in my own daughter's life. I was both touched by this, but also concerned. So what if all my participants wanted to catch up? How would I deal with that? Of course, I knew in reality that this was unlikely to happen. But at the time, it provoked a sense in me and concern about who I was, and who I was, in fact, to my participants. A friend, perhaps. And who they were to me. They were simply participants, potentially, and also, though, fellow parents who have a child or children with learning difficulties. All the relationships differed during the research process, and I had to work through these emotional quandaries. Another qualitative researcher, Jane Ribbons, qualifies and questions this process here. I quote, "What of my sense of audience here and now? How have I decided to include in my writing here, and how to present it to you? How have I arranged the pieces to develop an overall story? Perhaps you think I'm neurotic and anxiety-ridden, deeply lacking in self-confidence as a mother. Perhaps you think just the opposite, that I must be quite fundamentally confident to be able to write all of this down for a public audience. Or that I'm a wise old fool who knows she's one." Ribbons' research has spanned qualitative methodology, mothering and education generally, not within disability research, within a feminist framework, and discusses motherhood autobiographically, where she considers the difficulties of hearing her voice amongst an array of other mothers' voices. I too have been very much embedded in my research, but as the process unfolded, so did my many selves. Within a reflexive research process, as a feminist, I encounter mothers and fathers who have some common experiences to myself, that is, of mothering a learning disabled daughter or son in some cases. I want to explain, as a feminist sociologist, that I didn't simply find this area to be interesting, as I've already said, I was in fact living it. My insight into this area of research was brought about, as I say, by my own personal struggles, my sociological knowledge, and my ability to apply that knowledge. This reflexive process comes from the above knowledge applications and the influences of feminist sociologists such as Anne Oakley, Diane Ray, Jane Ribbons, and as feminists they raise questions about how to access, interpret, analyse, theorise research participants. Standpoint feminists such as Smith and Hartstock, and those commenting on it, as Harding does, and Smart, another name, do, argue it's not simply the experience of women, but that the experience comes from a struggle with oppression. As I understand it, my reflexive journey has come out of the development and recognition of my many selves, of which I will discuss in a bit, and the use of research journals and diary notes, as well as interview transcripts. So part of that process is actually making sure that we don't lose some of our research material by thinking, oh, well, it's just something I kind of like thought about after the interview. These are important parts of the research process, I would argue. I'd also argue that both Harding and Smart recognise the reflexive journey writers go through in a feminist research process. And it's not a case whereby a researcher can always allocate a type of feminism within which they feel comfortable with or settle for that position. I certainly feel my research process began as an empiricist sociologist and my feminism developed. So did my feminist empiricist epistemology emerge. However, now as I grapple with standpoint feminism, postmodern feminism, I continue to be reflexive in this process and this theoretical and methodological journey. And we just can't necessarily always label what we think and feel about how we're processing that research journey by labelling it as such. I'm continually trying to maintain a dialogue with this process and share the journey of the self as a researcher so as to understand social life. So in thinking further about the insider, as I would classify it to a certain extent myself, insider and both outsider actually, I carried out a participant observation, again another important qualitative tool, if you like, when doing qualitative research. This participant observation consisted of 2 National Association of Special Education Needs conferences, one a PHASIC conference, which is a conference for parents who have children with speech and language difficulties, coffee morning and support groups, legal advocacy training weekend, an inclusion steering group meeting, and a joint local authority and charity parents evening. And I've also attended conferences as an academic delegate giving papers. I sometimes found it hard to decide whether I was there as a researcher or a mother, because obviously some of these events really tapped into what I was going through and the process that I was going through as a parent. I quite often within this research wondered whether my role was that of a mother or a researcher, and more often than not I moved in and out of both those roles. And I find Sandra Harding's question as a feminist quite reassuring. To quote, "What is the appropriate relationship between the researcher and her or his research subjects? Must the researcher be disinterested, dispassionate and socially invisible to the subject?" My position clearly leans towards the passionate, interested and visible researcher. What made my position different? For me, the passion is personal as well as political, but still as a sociologist rather than a biographer. So, thinking about the research journal further, I wanted to show you something in another, out of my personal research notes, as another identifying kind of process whereby I was struggling with myself as a mother and also thinking as myself as a researcher and a delegate at a conference. It's in 2 parts because there's a lot of words, but I'll read it out, but you can follow it if you want. So from the research notes, as a member of the audience and a presenting delegate, I wait for the conference to begin. This particular one only happens every 5 years, so it's a big event for academics and education practitioners. The Inclusive and Supportive Education Conference is called Inclusive Education, Celebrating Diversity. The opening ceremony begins and the room is filled with music and young people on the stage performing their interpretation of inclusive education. They weave in and out, their bodies supple and mobile, their voices clear and their story profound. They sing and chant, seize the day, at the end of punctuated exclamations of individuality, sharing, creativity, success. A lump in my throat and a tear attempts to escape. I pretend I have something in my eye and look round to see if I'm the only one emotionally provoked. Either I was, or like me, everyone else was able to disguise his or her emotionality. This, after all, is a serious event. I recall my daughter being on stage, desperately trying to remember a line and me willing her to. Whatever, she was great. Back in the audience, I'm sad and angry. I know that the philosophical underpinning of inclusive education is in some way right, but is it not a little premature to celebrate it when we haven't got there? I think. I go back to my room and cry, for myself and for my daughter, who will always be different and indeed difficult. So in thinking about that process, finding your role within participant observation can be difficult. As I have discovered, Birch and Miller give an account of how Birch's role affected the dynamics of a group when she was attempting to explain her research and how this would be carried out. She felt uncomfortable with her position and struggled with this process. To quote, Maxine experienced tensions being a participant observer and found herself unable to perform 2 competing roles, researcher and group member. I found this to be the case, especially with regards to the coffee mornings. I'd hoped to complete participant observation at these informal support groups. However, I began to realise that I didn't want to research these mothers. They needed time to discuss their problems in a supportive and confidential environment, and I needed time to reflect with other mothers without being a researcher. At some of the conferences I attended, I was often switching roles between mother, which is daughter motivated, and researcher with the professionals, and then mother researcher with parents who were thinking about their own process and research process. An example of this is as follows. I was at an evening meeting for parents run by a local education authority and a charity. that supports parents with special educational needs. We were put into smaller groups, and after an introduction and then given the guidelines on what to do, we began to talk. There were 10 family members in my group, a father, 8 mothers and a grandmother. Some of their children were in mainstream schools, which is schools that include, the kind of ordinary school system. And then some were in special needs schools, for those who have moderate or severe learning disabilities, as in the UK. So from the research journal, I say, one of the facilitators asked, what would you like to talk about then? No one spoke initially. Then the father began by saying, we ought to discuss parental confidence, as my confidence as a parent has diminished, and that my son, who has Down syndrome, has just started school with a statement of special education needs, has been allocated 25 hours of support. He had only been at school for less than a term, and we were told that his hours had been reduced. No consultation, no meeting, his hours were slashed. He continued, you're always fighting. If you stop, you feel you will lose everything. I have no confidence, no trust. Things just happen with no consultation. So in that event, I was torn between keeping quiet, because I wanted to think and what was my notes going to say, and I was there scribbling away. So I was torn between being the role of researcher as an outsider and actually being a participant. I decided to participate. My child has been excluded in mainstream secondary school from certain activities, such as assemblies and a day trip, I recall. No one from the school had thought it necessary to involve me in this decision as to whether she should be included in these activities or not. Others guffawed at what each of the parents were saying and nodding in agreement. This group discussion wasn't only charged with anger and frustration, but with obvious pain, as one mother was trying to hold back tears whilst she spoke. So that night, on reflection, I didn't feel much like a mother. I felt I was in some way disentangled from the difficulties, as if I had learned to be a distanced researcher, while sharing my experiences. As Oakley argues, it's not easy or necessary to be uninvolved. To quote, it requires further than the mythology of hygienic research with its accompanying mystification of the research and the research as objective instruments of data production be replaced by the recognition that personal involvement is more than dangerous bias. It is the condition under which people come to know each other and to admit others into their lives. And Adler, in Parent as Researcher, The Politics of Researching in the Personal Life, discusses how in their research they are in different member groups, that of the parent member, the community member, the researcher member, effectively playing different roles and being seen as having different roles by others. In their longitudinal ethnographic study of children's worlds, they saw that the overlap between researchers' personal lives and the research role invoked methodological, epistemological and ethical issues salient to contemporary ethnographers. They then argue that the majority of the time we were able to integrate the research and the membership roles, engaging in them simultaneously. In this endeavour, the parental role served as the base and the research flowed out of it. So, commitment to different membership roles may change at different stages in the research process. As Adler and Adler found, though they had commitment to the parental membership, status was stronger than other membership roles, and this at times impacted on both them and those around them, both in the family and those being researched, and not always positively. Occasionally, they had to lose respondents, and I put that in inverted commas because they actually had people withdraw because they didn't want their children being involved in that type of research anymore. And it was about children's worlds, it wasn't anything to do with disability research. At the stage of the first interview, I was still under the illusion I could separate my different roles clearly. But as time went on, and as I reflected, it became clear this was increasingly difficult, and my roles, or myselves, would be woven into this research process. So, to a certain extent, in kind of coming to the end of this particular part, continuing as a participant observer, I recall how nervous I felt about addressing a large group of parents, and how these parents then asked about the possibility of talking to me about their experiences, as I illustrate here. It can sometimes be assumed that respondents are used as objects for an intellectual gaze, without the thought for their personal and emotional status. I would argue that the research process for them, in my case, the parents that I worked with is often a positive part of their lives. Many wholeheartedly wanted to speak to me. And to quote from a research journal, my research journal, it was April 2001 at the Aphasic Conference, an annual conference for parents who have children with speech and language difficulties. There were 142 names on the attendance list, of which most were mothers, 24 men, and the majority of them were fathers. In the opening discussion, some parents asked questions and others shared experience with the view to give knowledge and reassurance to others in a similar position. I thought it would be a perfect time to let everyone know about my research, hoping that they may want to share their experiences with me. So after summoning up enough courage, I stuck my hand up and shared some of my own experiences as a parent. I thought it was important they knew I was a parent, and that is quite a crucial thing when thinking about insider research. Although I could argue that it's not necessarily always beneficial. You can ask me about that or not. I was really nervous and my voice was cracking, my hands were shaking. I said that I was doing research in parenting children with special educational needs, and if anyone would like to share their stories with me in a form of an interview for the research. There was a low-level muttering and a couple of giggles, and I heard one mother say, "You wish you never said that," and another mother said, "I wonder if she knows what she's let herself in for." Given the response, I assumed that it was because many people wanted to talk. Throughout the day, people were coming up to me, giving me their numbers and saying how useful they thought that this research would be, and that it would be nice for someone to listen to us for a change. So as Reid, in her research on families and disabilities right, the majority of women expressed a great deal of interest and curiosity in the project, this is in Reid's research, and liked the idea of the study which listened to mothers' versions of their lives and recognised and respected their contribution. On reflection, I was a bit surprised and annoyed with myself for being so nervous. But after all, I was laying my own self on the line, or rather selves. So in this research, both as an insider and an outsider, there have been times when I've not really wanted to mingle or network. My own life and needs were more important at times, even though I may not always have been conscious of this. Certainly in Ellis et al., also discovered that subjective acknowledgement to the respondents' difficulties also affected how they would negotiate the process and how they would protect their own emotionality from this process. It can be all too easy to think because you're amongst the group of researched, in my case a mother of a learning disabled child, that you have the knowledge that goes beyond the research process. In theory, this may be the case, but in practice each story is very different. I too have been shocked and at times upset by the difficult circumstances of some of the parents' experiences. It can be at times unpredictable and unexpected. So, you've heard a bit about that whole research process and how the introduction of the research journal can be important in unpicking some of the problems and difficulties in negotiating some of these processes. But also, the research journal can also help us actually enter into the narrative, and using that with our interview data is an important tool in trying to open up our research. So I want to give you a little bit of the mothers, because I've introduced myself in terms of the research process and the journey via some of the reflective personal journal. But in terms of thinking about the mothers and the PhD research, I wanted to give you some of their voices. So I want to read you out a few of the interview narratives from my research. And I've set it up here because whilst I'm reading them, some of the theoretical and conceptual elements that come out of this research you would probably be able to link into if you were thinking about this analytically, thinking about expectation. So the fairy tale, what is a mother expecting when she's pregnant, for example? What is a mother expecting for the first time, if she's not had a child before? Or if she has had a child before and had a disabled child before, what is she expecting after that? Disappointment, that idea of losing the normal. And this comes out in narratives in terms of, if you link that back to expectations, especially in such a narcissistic society that we live in, consumerism, you only have to pick up magazines to see that, mothers are supposed to be glamorous, give birth, go back into their size, I don't know, whatever pants it's in Canada it is. But, so that whole expectation and the whole expectation of the beautiful baby, of course, more often than not, it doesn't occur because life just isn't like that. So that disappointment of the expected, so you can actually theoretically draw on that as well. And exclusion, so exclusion, social exclusion for the mother and for the child. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. So think about some of those things as I just read out the, first of all, the 3 small narratives and then a poem that one of the parents wrote. So Kim, thinking about expectation, has a son with cerebral palsy. She said, because I wanted it to be right this time. And I suppose what it is, you have this fairy tale in your mind where you get married and you have a baby and you push a pram around and you're going to have this beautiful baby that is gorgeous and lovely and cooing and all that. And it's just an illusion. And it was just something that little girls have. And then that illusion was shattered. Kerry, who has 2 sons, verbal dyspraxia and possibly autistic spectrum disorder diagnosis. When we went to a birthday party, a little girl got scratched on her eye, quite badly actually. He really did scratch her. The mother went absolutely berserk. And I was standing there trying to reason with her and say, I'm really sorry, and my son has a speech and language problem and he can't hear very well. And he has a problem with children around him. And she was saying things like, well, that's not my problem, that's yours. Then I discovered I was struggling at this point to fight back the tears, trying to be in control, bearing in mind there were 30 other people standing around me, all silent, and her screaming at me. Thinking about prejudice. Tracy, who had a son, these are all pseudonyms by the way, Tracy, who had a son with hydrocephalus, which is another name for water on the brain. I came back to pick them up at the end of the day, and I walked into the playground and the teacher beckoned to me, and the headmistress beckoned, and I went over to them, and she said, into my office please. I thought they can't have been naughty on the first day. She had twins, by the way. So she sent her twins off to school, and one of them has got hydrocephalus. So she said, I thought they can't have been naughty like that on their first day. She got me into her office. She said, take a seat. I wasn't aware I was having a bloody retard in my school. I went absolutely mental. I went berserk. I threw around the room. I did totally freak out. I built up their enthusiasm about going in, and I was excited for them, and I'd missed them. And to go into school to collect them, expecting to go in and say, hello darlings, did you have a good day? And I got that. As it happens, right, I'll just it's quite it's significant. She did, the police did come and, and everything, and she got arrested, and then they let her go, and she got a verbal apology, and the head teacher remained in school, which I thought was quite... This is not something that was happening, back in the day. This is in the 21st century, so being spoken to like that. And it's not the only example. It's not like me trying to shock you all, but there are plenty of examples where there's prejudice language. So we can sort of think about some of the expectation, disappointment of how we feel. And obviously loss of normal isn't the only disappointment that occurs. And exclusion. And this is a poem that one of the mothers in my research wrote. She's got 3 sons with various forms of autistic spectrum disorder and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The playground is what it's called. I stand alone in the playground, no one talks to me. I see the looks and hear the whispers. She's the mother of the little beast. The boy who can't sit still in the classroom, the one that falls around, the child who torments the others and throws himself to the ground. She must be a useless parent, no control or restraint. We'll go and see the headmistress and make a formal complaint. We want the loony expelled, you know the one we mean, the boy who runs around the playground as if driven by a machine, who sends other children flying, cuts and bruises everywhere. Get rid of the little menace, how you do it, we don't care. The brat who's been banned at lunchtime, the child who has no friends, the boy who's never invited to parties and Christmas cards, not one was sent. The child who cries because he is lonely and no friends invite him to tea, the boy who believes he is useless and not fit to be loved by me. The lad who is a loner, through no choice of his own, who struggles in the classroom and is made to sit alone. The boy who lags behind as hard as he may try, who at the age of 7 can barely read or write. And so I continue to stand alone, no one talks to me, the mother of the little boy who's been diagnosed with ADHD. And the reason why she wrote that poem was because the parents in the mainstream school put a petition to the head teacher to exclude the son, her son. So imagine how exclusionary that must feel if you're actually all, not all, but a majority of the parents. And that is simply because her son could not maintain the level of teaching that the other mothers thought that was required in the classroom. So from the other mother's perspective, their child's learning was being disrupted. So it's a really difficult quandary to be in, for example, for a teacher, for a parent with a child that has no disability at all. And so, so for all intents and purposes, trying to do work within, for example, within inclusive education, it's actually really tricky because you can't please everyone, often is how it feels. But you can see that the experience of that feeling is enormous, and so that kind of like emotional trauma that one goes through, for her, and I haven't experienced that, that's her poem and her experiences. So with regards to exclusion then, I'm just going to take one of those aspects and just kind of like unpack it a little bit. So with regards to exclusion, for the child, think about this, right? We're thinking about exclusion or within an inclusive education, and this is global, especially within the Western world, in Australia, within the States. I haven't done research within Canada, but going to the Human Rights and Intellectual Disabilities Conference, there's clearly inclusive agendas going on with regards to involving everyone in a kind of like inclusive way. So it's about thinking about how we can actually understand inclusion, and if actually it is simply rhetoric, and I'm not the only person to talk about the rhetoric of inclusion, because it's so obvious in so much of the research that we do. This guy Wilson says, if I'm unable to play a musical instrument at all, it seems to make little sense to say that I can be included in an orchestra, which is to play Beethoven. Or if I cannot even add up or subtract, that I should be in a group learning quadratic equations. Of course, I can just sit there alongside others, but this is hardly inclusion in any serious sense. But then it could be argued I ought not to be left out of these activities, however incompetent I am. And I think that quote does encapsulate some of the things that some children experience within an inclusive education environment. Some children who have some kind of a learning difficulty. And it's trying to, and obviously this has come out of the narratives from the PhD research, but it's trying to grapple with some of these philosophical ideas around how we understand inclusion. And then trying to think ideologically. Of course, in a utopian way of thinking, we would love to have and embrace inclusion. But at the moment, is that possible? And I'll just come on to that in a minute. But so Mary Warnock wrote in the late 1970s a big report. Some of you, anyone who's done research within education, especially in the UK, would know it as the Warnock Report. But it was basically a committee that was put together because there was such a lot of segregation amongst different disabilities about being included in society, and particularly within education, that this report committee was put together in order to understand how we can move forward about this, how we can change the pathological and medical aspect of disability, move it forward and start thinking about the educability of all children. As it found, it was a really horrible place to be, and there was a lot of exclusion, and things would move forward. So I can't for one moment think in the 21st century we haven't come a long way in terms of actually including and educating young disabled people. It was put in the media when Mary Warnock wrote this that she'd done a U-turn, there was a big sort of like pamphlet that she wrote in response to, well, just as because she was thinking about the whole process of inclusive education and how far we've come in the last 25 years or so. And she sort of like says, one of the things that she says is inclusion should mean being involved in a common enterprise of learning rather than being necessarily under the same roof. I mean, as I say, it was a big pamphlet, like a journal article. And so she was, by the media, said to have done a U-turn, but she hasn't, and other commentators have said, of course she hasn't done a U-turn. She's actually responding to where we're at now in the 21st century, which is, yeah, it's great, we're including children and everyone's being educated, blah, 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 but actually we haven't got it quite right yet. So, you know, we need to rethink about including everyone in the same space, if you like. So, in my research, one of the aspects of this particular area, it seems there are many children who are included in mainstream but are excluded at different levels. So the things that I found out in my research was that practically, even though they're classified on roll and in government statistics as being included, practically they're often removed from the class for one-to-one work in an individual teaching unit. So that's one area of exclusion. Intellectually, they're excluded because they often can't access the curriculum in the same way as their peers do. And then emotionally, they're often excluded because their difficulties can preclude them from sustaining friendships, networks, and engaging with others socially. So we're already seeing that actually, well, I'm seeing that actually it's not really working, and it's a bit bleak. Having said that, I'm trying to think about ways forward. As it does all seem a bit bleak at times when thinking about these things. So these exclusions are caused and compounded by testing and examination structure, cultural ignorance, and misunderstandings about difference and difficulty. So what I'm suggesting here is that, one, we have tests in the UK for age 7 and 11 and 14 and 16 and 8. I mean, you know, they've got tests coming out their ear holes, right? Now, these tests aren't inclusive in the sense that they don't actually, you know, they're testing one way to learn and that's it. So, you know, the idea of inclusive education and this testing culture is kind of like this. Yeah, it doesn't really work together. I mean, there are actually now, given the research that's been going on, there now moves, I think they're going to remove the 7-year-old test. But, so, you know, small steps and all that. But, so it's kind of thinking along those processes around what has come out of my research in terms of exclusion and the child. So moving on to the third part of this, and a bit more, let's say, autobiographical to ethnography and personal reflections. I'm well aware that I'm able to engage with qualitative research, in-depth interviewing, participant observation, and such like. But my own experience of parenting my daughter, it came to a point, especially as a young adult, I felt I had to write about this stuff. And I didn't have the research participants to draw on for this particular area of intimacy and sexuality. And so I didn't have the money to go out and do the research, which I'm trying to get at the moment, to actually do research with other young intellectually disabled women. But I felt I needed to write, and I needed to engage with both theory and social processes around intimacy. So in terms of thinking about that, Hart, I've got two quotes from Hart, one's from Hart and one's from Sparks. So Hart discusses in some depth the need for reflexivity in an attempt to shift our understanding of the data and its collection. And therefore, it's important to admit that we study things that trouble us or intrigue us, beginning from our own standpoints. But what makes writing about our lives social science and not a novel? How do we find the parallels in our experiences to make sociological sense of our own routines, or chaos for that matter? I like that quote because it kind of makes me think that, you know, I do like, and I am always attempting to draw on sociological knowledge, theory, method and such like, in order to understand social life. But also, I'm not the only one who thinks about how can we take a big phenomena and then use a personal narrative in order to try and understand that. And it's not rocket science in that sense. But in 1959, White Mills. Has anyone heard of C. White Mills? Oh, what does that mean? Yes.
We know 3 words, I think, pretty consistently.
So someone who was writing in 1959 and said about, in the sociological imagination, talking about private troubles and public issues. So that, to me, is also talking about this particular thing. And what I mean by that is, so for example, the public issue being unemployment, being domestic sexual violence, being intimacy, divorce, whatever. Yeah, these are public issues. We can statistically look at these things and we can have a map of the social process, of the patterns, if you like, by doing quantitative research. We can see patterns in our social life. But the processes are the things that I'm interested in. So going to the private troubles is where we might start in trying to understand those public issues. And the relationship is, I hope, two-way. So it's not simply saying that I don't want to know anything about the patterns of what's going on, but actually I do want to understand why. Yeah? It's no point in turning around and saying there was X amount of people doing blah or whatever. I want to know why. So that to me that's the important thing, that we can then take some of the personal experience, reflect on it, and then put it out there and say, yeah, this is what's going on and this is how people experience it. So Andrew Sparks questions those who are critical of autoethnography, for example, and in response asks, what substantive contribution to our understanding of social life does it make? What is its aesthetic merit, impact, and ability to express complex realities? Does it display reflexivity, authenticity, fidelity, and believability? Is it engaging and evocative? Does it promote dialogue and show potential for social action? Does the account work for the reader, and is it useful? I would like to argue that most of us who have done, as I say, I've only really scraping the surface with regards to autoethnographic work, but I would argue that the autoethnographic work that I've read and engaged with myself does do those things. And certainly would like to move it forward in thinking about social action and how we move ideas forward. So thinking about, from the mother, kind of a whole idea about sexual inclusion, I've got 2 vignettes, but I'm probably, what's the time? Where are we at?
10 to 1.
I'm going to read out one of them, I think, now. This is an autoethnographic narrative about exclusion and education. So it's not as evocative and emotive as some of the others, but it is really important when you think about autoethnographic narrative. So this is, to quote me, I remember being particularly upset when I discovered that Sarah, and that's the name that my daughter decided to name for herself, right, in the publication. I remember being particularly upset when I discovered that Sarah had not been included in an aspect of sex education at the mainstream school when she was 14 years old. As usual, I waited for the taxi to drop Sarah home. Have you any letters or notes for me to look at? I asked when she plonked her bags on the floor. Not really, came her most common reply. I had a look at her school home folder and found a letter. It read, a theatre company are coming to the school to perform a production about sex and teenagers as part of theatre in education. What a great idea, I thought. I read this out to Sarah to ask if she knew about it. Away now. As usual, her response was not forthcoming. To be fair, there were times when Sarah was handing out letters that she couldn't read, and verbal announcements were often made when she was out of class in learning support. Anyway, back with the production at school. I was excited about what it would involve, and Sarah, having been in a few productions with various clubs, I thought, what a great way to tap into her imagination. Sarah, I asked, would you like to go to this performance? Her reply was unmistakably positive. Yes, please. I knew Sarah could go to performances. and she'd attended the theatre with me on occasions at the university. The very next day I rang the Special Educational Needs Coordinator, called Senko, and I asked him about the event. Apparently the whole day was about awareness, sexual identity and relationships. Great, I thought. The event had already taken place. Senko said. His words ran through me. "What do you mean?" I quizzed. "Well, I didn't think to ask for your permission because we decided it would be inappropriate for Sarah." "Did you not think to ask me if I actually thought it appropriate?" I demanded. I was angry and explained that I thought education via performance was a good thing as it generates questions and discussion, and anyway, it wasn't like she was going to be able to read about it. The Senko was very apologetic, but for me, this was just another missed opportunity for Sarah and another nail in the governance and exclusion coffin. So that narrative, if you like, we can place that autoethnographic narrative within some literature. So, for example, before 1986, school-based education, sex education, was not even mentioned in any primary legislation. Lawson suggests that maybe we are reluctant to provide sex education for children on the autistic spectrum for fear of the potential outcome. In other words, we worry about the implications of people with autistic spectrum disorder getting married, having children, being able to parent, and other related issues. Sarah has experienced both mainstream education and education in special needs school. It is from the latter that she came home with conversations about condoms, bananas and sex. I have found this liberating and all too important. Should learning disabled children be excluded from sex education because they may be considered developmentally immature? Their developmental age might not be the same as their chronological age, and therefore might want sex but not fully understand the implications of such an intimate relationship or physical act. The same could be said of many teenagers who are experimenting with sexuality. So whose right is it to take away that particular education? Who were they worried about? Even as a young teenager where sex education would be useful, those governing, in this instance the Senko, had the power to exclude Sarah from this activity based on preconceived notions regarding a lack of intellectual ability. As Foucault suggests, it's not like teaching institutions have silenced sex talk amongst children and adolescents. On the contrary, since the 18th century, it's multiplied the forms of discourse on the subject. It has established various points of implantation for sex. It has coded contents and qualified speakers. So why then, when it's so evidently necessary that sex education is essential for learning disabled youth, many are excluded from such teachings? The fact that Sarah could not read too well already excluded her from one medium, and therefore in this case performance seemed an appropriate medium through which to stimulate discussion. Sexual identity for many teenagers, including learning disabled youth, is not simply about the physical act, but intimacy and social expectations. So for teenage girls, it's often about being able to tell others they have a boyfriend, especially when they're experimenting with this identity. So, in terms of, I won't do the governing and sexual because we won't have time, but so to go to the back to the method then, I'll therefore suggest as social researchers that we can focus outward on the social and cultural aspects of personal experience and expose the vulnerable self, because at times we are vulnerable, with a view to move through, refract and resist cultural interpretations. And finally, as Sparks comments, memories serve particular personal and social functions within the stories we tell ourselves and others to explain who we are, what we are, and where we are in life at a particular time and place. And however, personal and qualitative narrative alone is not always enough in attempting to understand deeper cultural, psychosocial processes. It's also therefore useful to construct knowledges that are aided by theoretical frameworks in attempting to make sense of a disabled social world. And what I mean by that is that it's this relationship and this flow between looking at personal narrative, if we're talking about autoethnography, for example, and thinking conceptually about what social theory, philosophical understandings about our social world also marry between the two. So I'm not suggesting that we make our lives into a novel, although to a certain extent autoethnography does do that. But actually we do that whilst we're also conceptualising what's going on and using sort of theoretical and philosophical understandings in order to understand the phenomena that we're looking at. That's it for now.
Well, discussion. What do you want to?
Any questions?
So your daughter, Sarah, who you're calling Sarah, how do you speak to her of your work, and how does she understand the question of picking a name and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, because obviously ethically it can be problematic, because, you know, I mean, you know, nationally, internationally, Sarah's Sarah, and it's really quite relevant to an extent. But it's not so irrelevant to those that know us, and also the wider academic circle as well. It's an important question in the sense that, yes, we did have a discussion. No, she won't understand fully, actually, what it means to an extent of actually being part of the research. We have a discussion, and she knows that I do this particular type of research sometimes, and she wants to be a part of it. I mean, I went through the processes of thinking how I'm going to tell this story. And before that, I went through the processes of thinking how can I tell this story anyway, without that autoethnographic aspect to it. So I thought maybe I'll do a case study and pretend it's someone else. You know, all these sorts of things, because to me it was the substance of what was going on which was important, to get that story out, to get those difficulties out, the exclusion, the sex in a park on a late night, the risk, the vulnerability and intimacy, and all those kinds of things that go on and are involved in you know, in kind of like young women and learning civilian sex and intimacy work. But I felt comfort, actually, in reading other people's autoethnographic work, and convinced that it was more important, rather than selling out, and I mean it in the sense that I felt I would have sold out if I'd have pretended it was someone else's story. I would have sold out to the fact that I'm buying into a distanced researcher, and I'm not. I can claim to have some distance. My PhD research had very little of, if you like, a biographical interlude in it. I mean, there was a bit of that, but it wasn't my stories, it was the parents' stories. This is not the parents' stories. And so looking at that spectrum, if you like, between deeply personal, reflexive, qualitative research that includes the personal experience, through to what I call mainstream qualitative research, there is a spectrum. I think that I think we need to address, and not everybody wants to do personal reflections and research like that. So I can't say that, hands up, yeah, she was fully aware of the kind of like implications of the research. But we can have a discussion, and we have discussions about what research means and what it means to tell my story. Also, within a disability, I remember speaking at a disability conference and much more about the autoethnographic stuff particularly. And it was almost like one speaker asked me a question sort of about how did you bring your daughter into that. And before I could even answer, another person in the audience said, yeah, but she wasn't talking about her daughter's story, she was talking about her story. And it was quite interesting to see them have that kind of like interaction, because it's what other people as well take from your work. And so what someone hears as her story, someone else might see Sarah as just being this kind of like thing, yeah, that's there, but it's actually my story. Because it was my story. It wasn't, and she was the catalyst, if you like. So I can't say that there's a right or wrong way of looking at it, but I can say that as much as you can ethically in this, you know, any autoethnographic work is never about yourself wholly, because there are family members, there is partners, there are, you know, I had to talk to my husband about this because he's implicated in it, you know, even though not very much, and he's an academic, he's not a at all reflexive. You met him, Esther. No, he's fine. But he's much. I mean, he's heavily theoretical and would not go down the sort of like personal reflections route, if you like. So so that idea, I had to kind of run that past him, but it's fine.
I can ask a question.
There is also one in
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see anybody. Who was it?
Yes.
Oh, I see.
Oh, thanks. I want to thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. It was great. Just wanted to make a comment on the autoethnography stuff you were talking about. In my work, I often make use of my own blindness, and in some ways, to even talk about whose story it is already a reflexive question, a difficult question. Is it your story, Sarah's story? And as you said, it's autoethnography, even though auto implies ethnography about the self. There's some sense in which we're a number of things, including a member of a particular culture, society, groups, and so on. So nonetheless, your story is reflecting some version of membership that you're then thinking through. So it's difficult to wonder about those things, but very, very wonderful to be in wonder of those things. And I wanted to just thank you for that sort of stuff, because your story, as I heard you reading it out, I mean, had a lot of wonderful kind of nuances in it. For example, one version of that story is that there's a mother who has a version of, let's just say, in common sense terms, progressive education. And that sex education is a good thing for children who are 14 years old. But then there's some version of exclusion. One of those children was excluded, Sarah. So already that's putting into question some notions of progress and how we understand that in relation to disability. So this, while children can progress, disabled children somehow or other either lack that capacity or aren't ready for it, as you pointed out. That's, was Sarah, or in terms of the person who decided not to have Sarah in that particular performance, or attend that particular performance. What would the issue be there? That every other 14-year-old was mature enough?
Well, conceptually, I think...
You did mention that many teenagers aren't, and I just said to the person sitting next to me, neither are many adults.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think for me, and having heard other stories, one of the key things in that particular one is that actually it's about looking at those who are governing and themselves. Shame, embarrassment.
Yeah.
To think about concept, if someone was to stand up and clap at the wrong time, or to whoop, or anything that was going to bring some kind of embarrassment to a particular forum, is incredibly exclusionary, and in the sense that, and to be honest, I genuinely believe that it's some of those aspects, rather than thinking about whether or not the child is ready, is more the case, because I think, and again, this kind of like falls out to sex education in general. I just think it's quite difficult for people to engage with it without feeling some kind of relationship themselves to it. And so I do think that there is an element of embarrassment and shame around that sort. But thanks for that.
Just one more thing in that story. I just wondered, besides Sarah, what and whom else was being excluded there? There's nice questions there. So thanks very much. I appreciate you talking about it. Thank you.
And thanks for kind of highlighting the fact that this is one story, if you like, but in a way, when I was at the Human Rights and Intellectual Disability Conference, there were a lot of parents in the room, and two co-speakers, one including Esther, and some of the things that the other people were saying in the audience was, oh my goodness, this is exactly the same story as I've got. And when you do qualitative research in general, and you might have really in-depth interviews, you get to the point where you're hearing the same story. And so whilst you might be accused, if you're doing qualitative research, of not being able to generalise, and of course we can't necessarily say this is the whole population and this is what it's like, but we can say these are the themes, this is what is coming out of the particular research that I've done, and more than one person is saying it, you know, and so, you know, and you can see that by just doing your research and doing your coding and finding, you know, the similar sort of themes and sentences that sing to each other and speak to each other. And then you come up with your own analytical response and you use your literature. I'm not in a teaching mode.
Okay. I just have about that sex education that you were talking about. I had one time, my daughter was 5 at that time, and there was some porn channel coming on the TV. They were sending out free porn feed. And I was flipping through it so that I can put a YTV or some kind of Cartoon Network for her. And she saw that channel going through. And after that, my wife also left, and I went back to my work in my room. And I felt that there is some change in the room. When she changed it, she switched to that porn channel. She was watching it. I passed through the room without making her, noticing her. She saw me and she switched the channel again, right? To her Cartoon Network. I went to the kitchen, came back, and I said, when she asked me, why don't you go outside and smoke your cigarette? She was like 5, right? So I said, okay, I have just a smoke. So I just went back. And I felt, how do I address this issue? I went back again, I passed through it, she tried to search it again, and I saw it, and she saw me looking at it. And I said, you don't have to search it. You can watch it, because I thought if she is doing it, why is she feeling that shame? So and then in the age of 5, she has that sense of privacy when it comes to sex. And she has that shame coming along with it too. So I said, let me sit with you and we can watch it together. And she wouldn't let me watch it at all. She would just hide that TV from me. And she would not allow me to watch it. And I said, all right, you can watch it, it's okay. I went back to my work, and she was watching it. When I called up my wife, I said, this was happening this way too. She said, when your son was watching it, when he was her age, and he just watched it, and you didn't say anything, why are you thinking, are you have something about her gender? I said, all right, and I have another problem to deal with here. And I didn't know how to handle it, but the way I handled it, and then I spoke to other colleagues of mine, and some of them, I wanted to turn that into a short film, and they said, well, this is too, they did not like it, they wanted to censor it. They thought letting your 5-year-old kid watch a porn channel is not good, and I could not answer it properly. So when you talk about intellectually challenged person going through these kind of issues, I thought about it right away.
That story is it brings to light that actually the human condition, if you like, is interested anyway in that kind of thing. We only have to go back to some social psychology, some psychoanalytic stuff. It depends on, psychoanalytic theory, to see that there are some of those things that are of interest. Also, cultural prejudice. We don't just learn about these things. There's a nuance and there's an interest about intellectual ability and disability, for example, impairment, that goes beyond, to a certain extent, some social boundaries that we're in now. Now, I can't tell you whether you're right or wrong. We don't have porn channels available to us in the UK. You can watch it online, I guess, but you can't just switch the telly on and it's not there, unless you pay for it. So we're obviously a bit behind. but it's interesting that there would be a huge outrage for some people to hear you talking like that, yeah? And then there's this outrage around sex education in general, right? Now, the things that are going on, I think internationally, but certainly nationally in the UK, is that this whole discussion around sex education. And people assume, though, that sex education is about teaching people how to have sex. And at 5 years old, what the followers and the people that are trying to make this happen, it's not about teaching someone to have sex, it's about teaching someone about relationships, intimacy, their body, you know, those sorts of things. But the trickiness of how you deal with it on a personal, you know, that moment where you see this is happening, you did the right thing, I guess, is talking to your wife and see where you're at. But it's true, the gendered nature of how we assume it's okay for boys, and there's a lot more vulnerability around thinking about girls is a poignant one in terms of, especially in feminist work. But I don't think they're really. I don't think I can give you an answer in terms of what route to go down. Yeah, back there.
Thank you for just a fascinating talk. I must tell you, it felt almost therapeutic for me because I had a fascinating experience just this weekend where I was on a research retreat. We did arts-based inquiry with 19 youth with 10, 19-year-olds who are youth with intellectual disabilities who all self-identify as queer, gay, lesbian, bi, or transgender. And it was all about their understandings and perceptions around sexual health. And I consider myself pretty reflexive researcher, but I'm telling you, it was loads of fun to begin with, but it was also like a chronic assault on all the prejudices that I didn't know that I had around what youth with intellectual impairments are like, what youth that are transgender are like, what current knowledge on sexual health is like. It was just endless. The more I went through these activities to learn about these youth, the more I kept having these kind of moments where the penny would drop for me in terms of something I didn't realize that I assumed to be a fact that was, of course, an inappropriately biased assumption. It was just, I'm exhausted at the end of that. So I thank you for this talk, because I sort of lived that out this past weekend as I went through these sort of reflexive somersaults the whole time.
It's really interesting, though, that the assumptions that we make about what we think other people should be doing or should not be doing, and I was constantly going through that to a certain extent in the qualitative interviews, and often, you know, when you come out of that sort of out of the field, if you like, even though it wasn't ethnography, but when you're sort of coming out at that point to then reflect on your work, so to speak, on the narratives, the transcriptions, and that you are, like you say, assaulted by the assumptions that you make and how people cope with things and how they understand things, and disgust at some things that go on. I know that I've felt like that in terms of like how some people deal with day-to-day life, and disgust of, and it's talked about. I mean, Tom Shakespeare talks about it in his work on disability, about the disgust of the abnormal and disgust of the, you know, of things that we feel uncomfortable with. And so I don't know. I guess some of those things are what you might have come up against this last weekend.
Can I ask a question here? I had so many questions when you were talking. It was a lovely, very, very interesting talk, because I think it spoke to so many different things, so many generic issues that have even nothing to do with disability. Going way back into early sociological notions of participant observations on. But I'd like to ask a methodological question about, I'm thinking about reflexivity as a methodological tool. And certainly when I teach qualitative methodology and so on, I make a big deal of reflexivity and what it can do for you, right? That this isn't just something that that it's not just qualitative methods kind of badge of identity, that, you know, you're reflexive and you wear it on your sleeve and then that's it, that you actually use it and engage with it in really productive ways. And it's very, very clear from your stuff how reflexivity contributed to your perspective and to the knowledge that you gained of this particular issue. And I was thinking about what are its downsides, what is the difficulties of reflexivity. Now, I'm not talking from a positivist perspective, what's the difficulty of reflexivity, because, you know, it's not objective, or I'm not talking about that kind of downside. I'm talking about what are what are the challenges of using reflexivity within the paradigm of interpretive qualitative research that actually it may be a problem. It maybe it doesn't provide insight. Maybe it obscures, or I don't know what I mean. I'm just wondering if you have any insight into what, not just the advantages of reflexivity, and it's very clear from your talk what it can produce for you. But where does it obscure? Or
I think,
where does it,
obscure is quite a good word actually, because clearly, like we have, like some people are able to engage with, say, quantitative research in a way that I can't. I don't feel I have the tools particularly. I also don't have the interest in that same way. But with regards to reflexivity, I think some of the difficulties within it means that there's a potential to lose sight of what it is we're looking at. You know, there is a potential to, and it has been accused of being navel-gazing, you know. So there is a potential to lose sight of what the bigger picture is, because the vignettes and stories are so deeply personal that our reflexivity almost gets lost, and that's what is important. We must not lose our ability to be reflexive. That's on one level, and we could go right through to. Let me ask you this, right? I mean, you might come up with something that I don't expect, but if I was to ask you who has influenced you, right? Would you pick out a piece of empirical research that takes you through decades, or would you pick out something that's philosophically driven or theoretically driven? You know, that's the question, right? And so with regards to reflexivity, right, I've got another answer to it as well, if that, you don't like that one. But for me, right, I am influenced by philosophers, by theory, by people who reflect upon the social world around them. Now, of course, in the 18th and 19th century, they were doing it very differently, right? They didn't have to sort of start defending themselves, but they were doing it. That's what they were doing. I mean, novelists were doing it. Jonathan Swift, brilliant writer. I mean, today's work, if he was observing the social world and making it up as a novel, the world in which he lived, he would be called a reflexive writer. And novelists do that anyway today, but we don't see it like that. And I'm not pretending that I want to be a novelist, because I don't. I want to actually talk about research. But philosophical and theoretically driven research, there is a fine line between that and reflexive research in that sense. I'm not saying that it's bad to have empirical research. I think we should all do empirical research. I think it's great, right? But I also think in terms of longevity of thoughts and ideas, the reflexive research process comes out in our understandings of something that's much deeper and a bit more abstract than empirical research.
Now you're contrasting it to empirical, whereas in fact I think reflexivity is empirical. It's just that you're the subject. Your own experiences or your own things is a bit of empirical evidence, and a very strong one, because you're very intimate with it. But you combine it with other kinds of things to play it off, to compare it, you engage in the interpretive process using your own experience as another piece of empirical data. So it's not that or empirical. They're all empirical.
I'm not suggesting that it isn't empirical. I'm just kind of like teasing out some of the reflexivity. But on the methodological front, in terms of what you might lose as a reflexive process, and this is a learning process in terms of like how you actually do your research. For example, just really simple one is that if you're engaging with someone and you're talking it through, and you both know what you're going on about, you lose aspects of your research. If you, for example, tape in a conversation in order to decide to reflect upon this or to use as a piece of research or whatever, the hidden text, the conversation that goes something like, Know what I mean? Yeah. And the constant know what I means that goes on in a dynamic, interactive interview. I remember going back to a transcript of mine and thinking, this is worthless, absolutely worthless, because it's full of innuendo, know what I mean. Of course I know what they mean, because I have a common experience. But the loss of that kind of reflexive process is gone, because actually I can't reflect upon something that is not there in empirical, in that empirical terms. So you have to then think, right, actually, how am I going to continue with this? So you then, by very virtue of doing that particular exercise, slightly distance yourself, because you are in the moment, but you're also saying, yeah, I do know what you mean, but can you elaborate on that? Or yeah, I do know what you mean, but tell me about this experience or whatever. So in that reflexive process, it's important. So you've got that reflexivity within an interview, for example, position where you can lose meaning because you're not actually engaging as a researcher, as a reflexive researcher. You're engaging in a conversation.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the balancing of, the advantages of insight that comes from your personal proximity and engagement in it versus the advantage of being the naive observer who asks more abstract questions of things and questions things because you're able to question it because you don't take it for granted. And that balance, the wicked balance, is when you have both your own experience and the reflexivity to draw on and are able to step back and even ask about the things that you do take for granted as an insider. To be able to do both simultaneous, to me, is the most powerful combination of being a scientist and
it's hard.
Yeah, really hard. But boy, is it powerful.
Yeah.
To me, it's the most powerful contribution that interpretive research can make, because it achieves that insider without, and yet you create also a certain naivety, a certain ability to step outside it and to be critical. And that to me is what the critical aspect is, to be critical of one's own reflexivity is
But
terrific.
also, by doing that personal reflection, you also are aware that because it's not a novel, it's not simply a story, you are also going to other research, you're also looking at other literature. So by doing that process of going backwards and forwards from your own personal narrative to other, you can begin that kind of like weighing up, that
Right, and so that's what
process.
makes research different from a novel.
Yeah, the theoretical lenses.
Yeah, and the ability to step outside it and look in is what makes it different from a novel.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, there are some references on the. If you, I don't know if this is going to be made available.
This will be
Yes.
up on the CQ website, and the references as well go up there. So
And have the, it's okay with you to